Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this year's Green Futures webinar. My name is Andrew Marriott. I am the Rural Advisor for CLA East, and I'll be your chair for today's session. We'll just give it a few more moments whilst our attendees dial into the session. We can see the numbers going up on the participants bar, but we'll just give people a few more seconds to join us. Hello for everybody that's dialed in and joined us this afternoon. So my name is Andrew Marriott. I am the Rural Advisor for CLA East. I have the great pleasure of chairing this afternoon's Green Futures webinar. So thank you for dialing in. Just a very quick reminder that this event is being recorded. It will be available for you to watch back at a later date. We will publish the webinar on the CLA's website, and no doubt the NFU will do the same. So please do bear that in mind. In terms of housekeeping, if I could just ask attendees to keep your microphones on mute and your cameras off throughout the webinar. We've got an excellent panel of speakers lined up today. We will conclude things with a panel session or a Q&A at the end. So if you would like to ask a question, you have any burning questions throughout the presentations, if I could just ask that you save them to the panel session at the end and enter your questions via the Q&A function rather than the chat function. I believe the chat function has been disabled, sorry. So please use the Q&A function to ask any questions that you have. We will try and get through as many of them as we possibly can in the time that we have. So we have about 15 minutes for questions at the end. So we'll try and answer as many of those as we possibly can. Reminder as well that basis and Noroso points will be available, and that's for anyone that's joining the session live. So I will give you some details as to how you can claim your points at the end of the session, but you will need your basis account number handy at that point. So please do keep that in mind. If you need to go and grab your basis number, you've got a few minutes to go and do that. So in terms of the format for today, we've got 4 excellent speakers. We'll run through the presentations and I'll conclude with the Q&A. Our speakers are Richard Wordsworth, who is the Senior Advisor on Support Schemes from the National Farmers Union. He's going to give us an update on the grants and funding available from government as we continue through the agricultural transition, and also what we need to know about the de-linked payments process, which is obviously still a very important aspect of the current funding landscape. So important that you get an update in that regard. We'll then be joined by Dr. Adam Freer, who's a Senior Catchment Management Scientist from Severn Trent Water. He's going to run through Severn Trent's catchment management approach and outline the funding opportunities that they can provide to farmers within the area. We'll then have Richard Reynolds, who is the Senior Agronomy Advisor from Anglian Water, and he's going to discuss a lot around the best practices that farms can adopt to build sort of more resilience and protect the water environment, and obviously outline the support that Anglian Water can provide. And then finally, we'll have Bethany Turner, who is the Environment Policy Advisor at the CLA. Bethany is going to talk us through the main mechanics and considerations for nature markets, and with a particular focus on biodiversity net gain. We know BNG is obviously very much upon us now and going mandatory within the next week, so we'll get a bit of an update on that particular policy area. As I said, at the end of the session, we'll come together for a Q&A, so there will be time for you to get your questions answered, and we'll try and get through as many of those as we can. It would really be helpful to us if you could just specify who your question is for when you ask it in the Q&A function, just so that we can direct that to the right person within the panel. Okay. So without any further delay, I will hand you over to Richard Wordsworth from the NFU. Richard will kick things off for us. So Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome everybody for this afternoon session. I'm going to run through over the next sort of 9 slides, some key areas to look at on that side. So if we move on to the slides, thank you, and we move on to the next slide. What I was going to start off with was around D-Link payments, and hopefully this will be something that's familiar to those who have claimed basic payment scheme in the past, is that the RPA issued electronically in November and in paper form from the middle of December onwards, an information statement that showed your reference amount that will be which will be used as the basis of your D-Link payments, which will be issued in 2024, 25, 26 and 27. The key message here, excuse me, is to check that you've had the statement. If you've had the statement, then please check it. If you haven't had the statement from the RPA, then please call the RPA as soon as possible if you don't recognise you've had it. Like I say, they were sent by email in November, or paper versions came through if you didn't have a business email address in December. It's critical to have a look at it because the data that it shows will be that base of that D-Link payment before any progressive reductions are applied to it. It will be adjusted for some penalties, so the figures may not quite tie with what you got paid in those particular years, but it's really key just to have a look at that. Key is then obviously to react to that if there are any issues, and the key point to note is that there's a deadline of the end of February to react to the RPA by challenging the figures on that. So there's an illustration there of the D-Link payment statement for you to have a look at, and there's obviously information on that to follow through, which hopefully is logical and informative. So moving on to, that's what's happened to date. Why I've put D-Link payments on here at this particular time in the year is that we're moving to the next phase of the transition from BPS into D-Link payments, and that includes a ability for people to transfer value from those statements that I've just talked about to another business that claimed BPS in 2023. So you can only transfer value from your statement to somebody else if they claimed BPS in 2023. And there's a one-off transfer window that's opening on the 15th of February that runs to the 10th of May this year for people to be able to transfer value between the statements that they have received. Now, a statement goes out to an SBI number, so that's the business it's associated with, and that's the critical thing to note where the value currently sits. Now, you may think this is rather academic and why I'm raising it today, but actually there are a number of scenarios where people may need to do a transfer and perhaps didn't initially think that they needed to do a transfer of this value off that information statement to somebody else who will then benefit from that value going forward as being the basis of their D-Link payment. And so I've got three main scenarios that may or may not be relevant to you. The first one is business structure change. So if in the reference period where the D-Link payments is based on from those BPS values is the 20, 21 and 22 years, if we're during that any years within that period, your business changed, the structure changed, there was a merger, there was a split, the issuing of a new SBI number, then clearly what has been presented to you by those information statements will be relevant to that business. If that business no longer exists and you know it's become a different form, for example, a sole trader into a limited company and the RPA has issued a new SBI number, or a business has split, two brothers have split into their own businesses and one of them's got a new SBI number, or indeed businesses have merged, then you may need to use the transfer window to move value from one statement to another statement, and the statement it's being moved to is the one that will essentially be receiving the D-Link payments going forward. So one just to really look out for in that respect. The next one is where there may have been a farm sale or a tenancy cease, or even a tenancy start within that reference period from 20, 21, 22. And depending on what the terms and conditions were of those transactions, land sale or tenancy change, then there may be some requirements within the terms and conditions for value to be transferred between parties. The answer to whether you need to transfer will be determined by what the terms and conditions are. So please do look that out and perhaps refer to the people who are involved in those transfers of land or tenancy arrangements in the past. And then there's a final group that may not have claimed BPS in 2023, that may have value from previous years. They may no longer farm, and there is. If they didn't make a claim for BPS in 2023, then their value will be left unaccessible by anybody else going forward. So they may be in a position where they want to transfer that value to somebody else to potentially receive some value back out of that transaction. So lots of rules there. Please read the guidance. There are specific rules for inheritance, which I haven't set out today, but hopefully that just gives you a bit of an idea of what's coming around the corner in this transition period. So moving on to the final slide on D-Link payments. Just to remind you that D-Link payments will be paid in 2 instalments, an advance payment of circa 50% made from the 1st of August this year, and a balance from the 1st of December this year, and that rhythm will continue going forward. You will not need to apply for the D-Link payments. The RPA will pay it into the bank account that they have records for, connected to the SBI number that that value from the D-Link payments information statement came from. Really critical here is, I suspect quite a few of you also fill out an annual revenue claim for Countryside Stewardship or HLS, and you may do that at the same time as you used to fill out your BPS form. No BPS forms this year to complete, so therefore you might forget to do your annual revenue claims for Countryside Stewardship and HLS. Please just put a note in your diary to complete those annual revenue claims in that March, April, May period when they generally are filled in, so you don't forget them because you have no trigger to do with basic payment scheme. So that's where we are with D-Link payments. There's a link there to go for further information. I've literally just covered the headlines today. So moving on to the next slide, which covers the Sustainable Farming Incentive and Countryside Stewardship. And really what I wanted to do here was just update you at a very high level of where we are at this point in time. So the SFI offer is still open. If you haven't applied for it, it's still open. There was a bit of disruption at the end of last year where they had to close down the access to making the application to change some technical elements within the timing of the date within the system. That's now all passed and people are now submitting SFI applications. So we still have that offer available, 23 actions across a range of different areas: soil management, nutrient management, arable and horticultural soils, low input grassland, improved grassland. It is still available if you haven't applied to this point. Now, what you may have picked up early in December was the intention for DEFRA to roll out a newer version of the offer, and so we have the headlines of what that will be. The DEFRA's intent is start to merge together the SFI offer that we know about, adding in new elements to the SFI offer, and combining that in with effectively a single application portal, which will also combine the mid-tier Countryside Stewardship offer as well, which is being evolved at the same time. So that is expected to be rolled out in the summer. We don't know any more details than that, with agreement starting in the autumn. The key here is they're trying to align the offer between those two different schemes. Countryside Stewardship, as a result, will be moving to a rolling application windows and quarterly payments similar to the Sustainable Farming Incentive. And there will still be the ability later this year to effectively pick a mix across the Countryside Stewardship and SFI actions. Anybody looking at higher tier Countryside Stewardship, that sits separate from what I've just talked about, and we're waiting to hear more details about that streamlined offer of access, which will be rolled out this year, but probably not in the period that people are used to, which is the February, March, April sort of time of the year. Those of you in HLS agreements, those will be retired out as they come to the end of the transition period, which is 2028. They will still be rolled over going forward. So let's just move on to the second and final slide on SFI and Countryside Stewardship. Other developments this year that were announced earlier this year around payment rates have again been reviewed, and there's been an average 10% increase on some of the CS and SFI payment rates, which will apply to the people in current schemes at the moment, or those entering into them, but not all rates have changed. There's a more fundamental change in payment rates across CS and SFI, and also some rebalancing between the creation of habitats and land uses and the maintenance of them. There are going to be some more SFI options coming down the track. These include no-till farming, multiple species, spring and summer or winter cover crops, ditch management, permissive access to footpaths, stone walls. In addition, From perhaps a slightly more perhaps countryside stewardship side of things, there'll be some premium payments where effectively additional payments will be added for a range of options which are going to give the biggest environmental impact. Some of the countryside stewardship options, as I mentioned, have been updated, but what we critically don't have at the moment is the detail of how these options will actually work. What is the eligibility? What is those characteristics of those options? So we are waiting for that guidance to come out, which hopefully will be out perhaps in next 2 to 3 months' time. And then also we need to understand how you are going to apply for this reviewed offer. So that's the offer that's coming down the track for people who may not have engaged at this point. Clearly, there'll be people looking at SFI now. We would strongly recommend people that continue to look at SFI because the timelines of actually accessing this revised offer of 24-stroke countryside stewardship is still not known on that side. So that's where our countryside stewardship and SFI. If we move on to the next focus, which is the capital grants and the Farming Investment Fund. Again, there's a link there for further information. And what I've done on this slide and the next slide is just go through where we are at the moment, what's available, what's coming around the corner, so you don't miss anything that you may be interested in. So at this point in time, we have in the large grants, this is Improving Farm Productivity Round 2, opened about 10 days ago now. That offer is open for people to put initial applications in after online eligibility checker. There's 2 themes within that. One is automation and robotics with a £15 million budget. But the one that's I think attracted a lot of attention, certainly from our members, is the rooftop solar offer. So there's a rooftop solar offer of a 25% grant contribution, minimum grant £15,000, therefore £60,000 project to locate solar on building roofs, not domestic. Have a look out for that and read the guidance carefully to understand what's also included in that. In terms of the small grants, we have the Farming Equipment and Technology Fund, which has been very popular over the last 2 years with the previous offers. Again, a very similar offer expected this year, grants between £1,000 and £25,000, essentially online application. If you get shortlisted, then you're given a grant funding agreement. You then go out and purchase your items. Once you've got those items, take photographs of them, have the paperwork, the bank statements to show you purchased them available, and make a claim into the RPA. We're expecting information on the 2024 offer to come out in the next few weeks. There were 3 themes this year. Those who were interested or looked at it in 2023, there were only 2 themes. This time around, the productivity theme and the slurry theme have been split out. So if you want to apply for items on either of those, you've got to apply twice, one for each respective theme. And then there's the animal health and welfare theme, which was separate last year. What we are expecting is there may be multiple application windows for the animal health and welfare theme throughout 2024, but you'll only be allowed to apply once. So just consider that when that comes around. So moving on to just conclude on the Farming Investment Fund opportunities this year, and these are the large grants, again, £25,000, possibly up to £500,000 grant funding. We have the Slurry Infrastructure Grant Round 3, which will be offered later this year. We then have a number of grants that have been spoken about at the Oxford Farming Conference earlier this year, which we have very little detail on. On an animal health and welfare point of view, there's a laying hen housing offer coming down the track. There's an adult cattle housing, and then there's another calf housing also offer available. We then have a water management grant round 3 that is expected later this year, which will probably follow very similar to previous rounds, infrastructure, reservoirs themselves. And we may or may not see an adding value to agri-food offer, depending on how the level of interest was with round 1, which closed for full applications at the end of January. So that's where we are in terms of grants. Details will come down the track, and I'm sure along with the CLA, NFU will continue to ensure that members are kept abreast of when these opportunities come available. So I'm just moving on to my final couple of slides. Just a couple of other reminders of things that are currently available that may have sort of slipped your mind or you haven't heard much of recently. So we've got the Farming Resilience Fund. This is available to those who claim BPS, and was set up to help businesses that claim BPS to offer some professional support and advice to help transition away from basic payment scheme, direct payments, D-Link payments to a world without those. So that offer of free confidential advice is still open to anybody who's in that category. If you've already applied in round 1 or round 2 of that, then you're still eligible for this current round, which will run until March 2025. If you haven't looked at it, please do look that out, and there's a link there to the organisations that are offering that service in your area. By all means, do a bit of a beauty parade with them, speak to them, see what they can offer. They all offer slightly different things. What's right for you is really important, whether it's diversification, landlord-tenant, succession, or indeed it's looking at your environmental credentials as a farming business. So have a look out for that one. And then on my final slide, a couple of other reminders: annual health and welfare review for livestock keepers with beef, sheep or dairy cattle, that pigs, that is still open. Paid vet visit, proactive, is still available to you. And there's a link there to a very useful video on that. It is now open to anybody, irrespective of whether they claim BPS or not. And then final points, cross-compliance finished last year. Please be aware that whilst cross-compliance finished, the majority of the cross-compliance rules still continue, and the DEFRA arm's length bodies will continue to inspect and check on those, including the RPA, Natural England, AFA, Environment Agency. So please do bear in mind what your responsibilities are. We are still waiting for how hedges will be, hedgerow management will be legislated for after the end of cross compliance. That's both the cutting period and the margins next to those hedges. We are expecting some news on that shortly. And if you're a bit of a loss of where to go and find what the key things that you need to follow as a farming business, we worked with DEFRA over a year or so back to produce a hub on gov.uk where you can find the main regulations that you can follow for your business there. And we've got the link up on that slide. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for your attention, and I will now pass over to the next speaker.
Thanks, Richard. Yes, unfortunately, my camera isn't working, so you just have to listen to me for the next few minutes. Yeah, I am Adam Freer. I'm a senior catchment scientist from Severn Trent Water, although I used to be the Severn Trent Ag Advisor for Nottinghamshire as well a few years ago. You just go to the next slide, please. So yeah, just a overview of what I'm going to talk about. Really, why are Severn Trent as a water company doing catchment management, and then really look at the offers that we have and the support that we can give the farming sector in our areas. Next slide, please. So we undertake catchment management for a variety of reasons at Severn Trent, mainly because our surface and groundwater drinking abstractions can be impacted by risks from the surrounding land, and we try and help to manage those risks. So for instance, the possible causes are cropping. We also have issues with high nitrates from fertilizers, slurries and digesters. And then we do get issues with cryptosporidium, which is a sort of a microorganism which quite often is derived from animal wastes or slurry. The traditional way that water companies have dealt with this were to pour concrete. However, there's a much better and sustainable way of doing it, which is working with the agricultural sector and help bring benefits to farming businesses. It's the most sustainable option, and there are wider environmental benefits possible working this way. So for roughly every £1 spent, there's about 4 gained in wider environmental benefits. And also some risks are very, very hard to remove through traditional measures. Most people remember metaldehyde, and then things like cryptosporidium can be highly resistant to disinfection methods and difficult to remove. So next slide, please. So we work across the Midlands. We actually stretch all the way up to nearly Scunthorpe and towards pretty much Gloucester. So each patch, but within that area we do have priority catchments where we particularly focus our work and our efforts to try and address various water quality risks. We work in 5-year cycles, as most of the water industry does. I think we started this 5 years with about 33 catchments, and that's now grown to about 50. You can hopefully see on that map there, although I appreciate the colours do sort of blend in a little bit. Each catchment has a various water quality priority, which is usually pesticides, cryptosporidium, or nitrate, and you can go and check that online by the link there. There is a rather slow online map where you can punch your postcode in, and it should ping up if you are in a catchment or not. Most of the blobs there, so the larger areas on the left around where Derby are, that's the Derwent catchment. We've also got bits of the Dove. Towards the right, there's a series of blobs which sort of run between the A614 and A60. They're mainly nitrate catchments in Nottinghamshire. And then as you can see further down, we've got the Whitaker catchment around Coventry, and then the Avon and the Lem catchments, which are for pesticides. We work in these areas through our dedicated agricultural advisor team. So we have 7 in-house agricultural advisors and 12 partnership advisors. Many of them are from farming backgrounds themselves, so they know the ins and outs of farming and are a wealth of knowledge. And really, they're there to provide one-to-one advice and as much support as is needed in terms of funding support for our schemes. Next slide, please. So the sort of the flagship scheme that we offer, which I imagine many people here will have heard of before, is the Severn Trent Water Environmental Protection Scheme, or STEPS, which has been running for nearly 10 years, which has gone pretty quickly. It's a voluntary but competitive scheme open to farmers in our priority catchments. The current round opened on the 1st of February, and it will be running until the 30th of November this year, which will be the last opportunity to apply in what we would call this AMP, so the last chance before 2025. We will be into a new cycle of funding and schemes, so there will be something following, although we're not entirely on that yet. Any work that's applied for this year has until the 31st of December 2024 to complete, and through that you submit some evidence and claim, which is all laid out in the handbook. There's around 50 options to choose from, although we do keep on adding more and splitting them out into various bits of technology or thinking comes through. It's quite wide ranging, so we have everything in there from cover cropping to pesticide washdown areas. We started offering closed transfer systems last year, and precision equipment such as GPS is popular. There are some biodiversity focused items which are available in our groundwater catchments, things like herbal layers, annual pollinator mixes, and like spring sun birds. There is also a farmer innovation option, which has now, again, grown into a few different categories. So if you have a particular idea that you think will improve water quality and the environment on your farm, we're open to listening to that. And yeah, you can bring it to us in your application and we'll review it, and then we'll try and accommodate it. And those generally centre around clean and dirty water separation within a more generic category as well. As I said before, the scheme is completely supported by our Severn Trent agricultural advisors, who are there to help you as much or as little as you need along with the process, and help you with submission. Although speaking to them is a much more guaranteed way of the application being successful. The funding through there is roughly worked out about 50% of cost, but some options are a little bit more, and we do offer a cap of £10,000 per farm holding per year. Again, if there are specific things, particularly through farmer innovation, which are maybe higher than that, we are open to suggestions. Next slide, please. So just focusing on a couple of the offers which are in the handbook. One is the pesticide washdown area offer, which are mainly focused on our pesticide risk catchments. So we straight up offer 50% funding up to about £20,000, and then there's an additional £5,000 for rainwater harvesting if you want to fit it. The last chance to apply for these is going to be the 31st of May this year for a completion by the 31st of December. The reason for that really is just because we have limits on when our funding runs out. So we want people to give people plenty of time to install and get them running and get a claim in rather than leaving it too late. If you can complete inside 6 months, there's an extra 25% bonus. So the goes up to 30,000. And within that, you would be expected to include a bunded pesticide washdown area, and then aligned by a bed or by a filter to accompany it. And then should you choose to roof over that area as well, that's encouraged. To apply, you need to provide a plan before photographs, quotes, and intention of things like planning permission with the application, and then that'll go off to Severn Trent to be reviewed. We do offer specialist on-farm advice visits or SOFA visits to go with these. It's a good idea to inquire with an advisor first while thinking about doing a washdown area, and then the visit can be booked in well in advance, as they do sometimes take a little bit. Next slide, please. So we do also have a cover crop offer. So now priority nitrate catchments for groundwater, the rates were uplifted for the cover crops, of which we have a few different options. And then there's also the benefit of getting free soil testing should you want it. So you'd select the type of cover crop you want in your application, which includes standard cover crops, undersown maize, cropping after maize, and short-term catch crops. If you aren't entirely sure of which fields they might be going into, and so hectareages, that's fine. Just put in a guesstimate, and then we can bottom it out further down the line. If you want the soil testing, you can tick the soil testing box, and then that'll be put forward for a visit. And yeah, in terms of evidence, things like marking where on the farm you're planning on putting the cover crop, any sort of cropping records, and before pictures showing what the current crop is. The point there about being able to apply alongside SFI, we have changed that a little bit as we're just taking a little bit more guidance on that, as there is some slight grey area as to the blending of public and SFI funding. But we are reviewing that at the minute. And yeah, as I said, there's various cover crop options available depending on what your farm needs are. Next slide, please. So we do offer a few other bits of support as well to catchments. So as I said before, we have our specialist on-farm advice visits. They are a longer list than that's currently on screen, but they include testing, farm infrastructure, which includes just a complete sort of overview of your farm, focus on buildings, stuff like that. Special guidance on how to construct pesticide wash areas. Then others on how to manage water on the farm, as well as others. There are some around nutrient management planning as well. We do have a swap your nozzles scheme, which we run. In fact, the current scheme's just closed in the past month, and that's around practice with spraying. And if you attend the webinars, you can get some low drift nozzles for free. We will be running the scheme in future, so keep your eyes open for next round comes. They're normally around autumn and spring. The current round started in December and it's just run through into January. We do also have a Severn Trent webinar series which covers various topics. If you just want to move on to the next slide. Sorry, next slide, please. Yeah, just a plug for a webinar which is actually happening tonight if you do happen to find yourself free. So it's focusing on undersown maize with cover crops. And it's 6:30 till 7:30. The link and the QR code should work if you, I don't know if they'll work if you try and scan them off your screen. But yeah, just an hour-long webinar. John Morgan from the Maize Growers Association is the guest speaker, just offering advice and guidance, which should make it a really good webinar. If you do happen to want to join, you should be able to register right up to the event. So yeah, hopefully good attendance if you are interested. And I think that is it. If you flick onto the next slide. Yeah, so we do have a general queries email address, which is farmingforwater@severntrent.co.uk. If you want to find your local Severn Trent advisor, there is a link there, and there'll be a list which is kept up to date, and also a link there for finding if you're in our priority catchments. Our website is a bit of an overhaul, so it may change a couple of months, but yeah, all the information needed will be on there. And with that, I will hand you over to Richard.
Hi there, I'm Rich Reynolds from Anglian Water. I look after the catchment team, although the advisor that normally would be looking after this area, Chris Hewis, who I'm sure a couple of you on the call are already familiar with, sends his apologies for today. So I'm picking up in his stead. If we can get the next slide. So the focus on this talk here is to look a little bit at what we've been seeing in the catchments and then tie into some of the grants that we have been looking at and the kind of impacts and that sort of stuff of it. But first, a kind of snapshot of the data. This is data across the Anglian region, but fairly representative when I looked at a little bit more detail for this kind of Lincolnshire area. The numbers are generally dominated by glyphosate. That says glyphosate and AMPA, which is essentially the metabolite that is formed when glyphosate breaks down. It's always the biggest one that we see. Although in terms of drinking water treatment, we can manage it. I think it's really important for the farming community to recognize how much of it we see. And although it's not a drinking water challenge, I'm conscious there are a lot of organizations that are focused on glyphosate. So just because the water companies aren't talking about it doesn't mean that it's not something that we need to be looking after. It's critical to everybody on this call and as a resource that we're all using. We use it in the water industry. And I think it's key to just make sure that we are looking to do what stewardship can we do? How can we manage it? How can we look after it as much as possible? Everybody on the call's got a way of looking at it and a way of looking after it. I would say if AMPA was stripped out there, the glyphosate number would go down proportionately. These are percentages, so everything else would jump up. So I think it's a fair representation of the presentation of the sorts of things that we see. And really important context here is this data is taken from where we take it out of the river, so at our abstraction points. We tend not to look at this aggregated data for lots of catchments because there's lots of little sub-catchments that there are individual enterprises or reasons why we've got higher numbers. But there is a broad trend of particularly the blackgrass herbicides coming through. This time of year, a lot of people inside my business are focused around propizamide, particularly because of the not being able to apply it after the end of January means that that week we had of dry weather between the wet mean everybody was out applying, and we've seen some really high levels of propizamide across the region. It's targeted, so when you look at the proportions across the whole year, it doesn't come up, but it is a significant problem for us, particularly at the end of January time when everybody's getting out and about. So stewardship is really important in those sort of tricky times there. What are we doing? A new one in recent years, flufenicet is starting to become more and more common, tied in with general practices, but we are seeing more of it. And the more that we see in the water, the more we flag up, actually, we need to be making awareness of it. Because of the nature of arable dominating a lot of the Anglian region, we don't see a huge amount of the grassland herbicides, so the 2,4-D in particular, but I know it is a problem as we go across to the west. So it's probably more of a challenge in Adam's area. Interesting to see the trilators jumping quite so high up there. I don't have a specific as why trilate's dominating to that degree above everything else, but I would put it into that broad basket. Bentazone is an interesting one. It is typically a challenge that we have, particularly on groundwater sources. Most other pesticides seem to be broken down in the length of time that they take to travel through the groundwater system to get through. But bentazone in particular is very resistant to that degradation. Often we will have areas where it does dominate, but particularly with the climate variation we've had, it's not unsurprising to have an area where bentazone hasn't been used for 5-10 years and suddenly we get an exceedance. The challenge with groundwater sources is it doesn't tend to have had the investment of pesticide breakdown and removal that our surface water treatment sites will. So our groundwater sources are far more vulnerable when suddenly we get bentazone or something like that coming through. So there is a lot more work happening around bentazone and bentazone stewardship. Although it's only 5.8% in the surface water, it's particularly if you're in a groundwater source, be aware of it and look at the stewardship and the good practices associated with it. I'm going to touch on a couple of examples there if we can get to the next slide. So a brief example at our Hall treatment works, which provides 20 to 30 megalitres of water a day going to Lincoln and pulls water out of the Trent, lower down than Severn Trent themselves do, but really important resource in terms of resilience and that sort of stuff for Anglian water. Incidentally, it is the one site in the country where metaldehyde removal could happen, and we built it in 2014, 2015, and we weren't allowed to build a site that was knowingly non-compliant. So essentially has the best available treatment technology that we could put into a site. We in mid 2023 had a spike of clopyralid come in, and we probably for the last 3 to 4 months have been failing our drinking water standard from clopyralid to the extent of all that water has had to be dumped. And it is something to be aware of, that clopyralid, by the nature of the molecule, tends to be quite heavy. It sinks to the bottom, it contaminates in the soil. So I would imagine there's a lot of irrigation reservoirs and those sort of things that could be contaminated by clopyralid. We have eventually got on top of the challenge, but essentially that was about flushing the system, flushing the system, flushing the system. In terms of treatability, it is the closest molecule that we have at the moment to metaldehyde, so represents a specific challenge from our perspective. The thing I would bear in mind here is that last year was a very wet year. So we had the resilience, we had the capacity to be able to just dump water resources rather than using it. If this had happened the year before, when we were in the middle of the drought, we wouldn't have had any of those sort of tools that are around. So the actions, the use, the products that you are using further upstream absolutely have an impact on what we can do. And as I said, this last year, it wasn't too bad because we had water, we had other water resources and more resilience. But if we look forward to a dry year, a pesticide spillage could cause a much bigger challenges. And the challenge here is that if we can show that products can be managed properly and we don't have any, well, then government doesn't necessarily look to remove them. It's when we start having unmanageable problems, then government tends to get involved on what else might need to happen. So it's kind of sharing this sort of information specifically around clopyralid. And this isn't the only site where we've had clopyralid problems. There is a site down in Essex where we've had a reservoir that feeds one of our an irrigation reservoir feeding one of our major reservoirs that's been contaminated for 6 or 7 years. and we're slowly getting on top of it. But be aware of clopidogrel. When it gets into reservoirs, it stays there for a long time. So next slide, please. So just looking in terms of nitrate, we are seeing an increasing trend of nitrates, but given the costs, it's something we must just bear in mind. This is a lot of historical data, and historically, nitrogen's been used at much higher levels. This is an example here, just a Risby borehole, but essentially just an example of saying focusing on nitrate is really important from a treatment side. So from our perspective, we would use ion exchange to remove nitrate, but it's really expensive. And it tends to be, from my perspective, a sticking plaster if there are things that we can be doing in terms of catchments. It's not necessarily totally obvious on this graph here, but if we look at those drought years, there is a big spike that comes through. And if the contamination stays in that borehole, we might have to shut down that borehole, and then we start working with more supply challenges. So just a really quick example here, but nitrogen is topical, whether you're talking about money and the price of nitrogen a couple of years ago. Water customers' bills essentially come in if we didn't have to put removal, and then we've got things like ion exchange to remove nitrates. That comes at a significant cost, as well as the challenges around net zero. So I'm not going to focus on nitrogen now, but just something to be aware of. Next slide, please. So I think hopefully a lot of people on the call are already aware of MAGIC. And this is just a heads up that the source protection zones that are currently sitting in MAGIC have been updated. So if you looked at the map and you were on an edge, have a look again and just see if it hasn't been changed. But very broadly, the 3 colored zones give you an understanding of the proximity and risk you are to a particular borehole. So it ties in hydrogeology. If you're in the red area, the zone 1, that is what we call the 50-day travel time. So anything landing in there within 50 days should be arriving at the abstraction. The zone 2, so the green areas, are the 400-day travel time, so it takes longer. And then the third zone is the total groundwater recharge source. As we get climate change and those sort of things happening through, we'll be pulling water from further away. So how the dynamics and that sort of stuff come in is important. I think more water in the blue areas is going to start being pulled through. There is a legacy of that we are seeing. We are seeing things that are jumping through. But the ask here is log on to MAGIC, see if the things have changed. So if there is a risk that you need to be aware of that you weren't aware of beforehand. Next slide, please. This is just a really quick thing flagging up all the, and I'm conscious that time is ticking through already. Lots of high risk activities, depending on what the sort of weather and climate we're having. There's always ways and pathways for whether it be plant protection products, nutrients, soil, all of that sort of stuff to move off the land, to move where it's doing good for you, where you're spending money for it and getting into the water, whether it's down into the groundwater, whether it's across into surface water. There's a vested interest for everybody in this call to keep everything on the field. Fortunately, there are support from all sorts of different organizations, whether it be water companies, whether it be other parts of the supply chain or DEFRA, to kind of tie into these things. We're always curious and interested in terms of what things you feel are important. So make sure that you are talking to your local water companies and those sort of things around what you might need. Next slide, please. So this is also just flagging up, and I probably don't need to preach this to anybody on the call here, of remembering how weather changes and how weather is different. So if we think back 2021, 22, 7 months below the long-term average rainfall, and then we turn around next year, we had 6 months above long-term rainfall. Realistically, that's what normal is probably going to look like in the future. The biggest worry from a water company perspective is probably 2 years with the drought, because that ties into the resilience of the water that we've got in our reservoirs. Fortunately, we've got a number of big reservoirs where we can circulate things around. But it is a reason why all water companies are thinking of how to add in more resilience into the systems that are there. So, you know, we've got, so yeah, our plan, some of you will probably be involved in our SPA pipeline, which is bringing water from broadly the Trent all the way down to Colchester. Some of you might have even been engaged in on new reservoirs. Severn Trent has got plans for more reservoirs, but there is a need to make sure that we're looking after things. And if you think about these things, also remember that clopyralid, fortunately for us, happened in a wet year. In a dry year, do you dump the water or do you fail the drinking water standard? And if we fail the drinking water standard, there becomes a lot more focus on those particular products that we're seeing. So if there's a takeaway, think about what's going on and what's landing on the water. Well, what's going out. Okay, next slide, please. So this is a kind of overview, just remembering that a lot of the practices that are beneficial for your farm business also as a secondary impact tie into water protection. And I'm not expecting that anyone on the call here is farming specifically for water, but anything that leaves the land, that leaves the field, is investments, it's assets that you've spent money on that you're getting no benefits from. So things like accurate nutrient assessment, planning and application. Does the fields need what you're getting? Are the crops that you're putting there actually doing the job they need to? The bare soils, do we need it? What are we losing? What are the implications of those sort of things? Nobody comes to a water company to get agronomic advice, but what we can tell you is what we are seeing out there. So certainly Anglian Water, we're putting much more focus on soil health rather than looking at lots of individuals. Different people are interested in things and every farm is different, but having an overall understanding of soil health has a benefit from the crop production side, nutrient retentions, and also that water holding capacity. So next slide. A very brief overview, because I'm not quite sure how much time I've got, of the sorts of schemes that Anglian has done. Severn Trent is a very established program that Adam's done a great job explaining. We've looked at things slightly different based on the resources and the needs we have. So some of the measures that we had were a training grant, looking to say we don't necessarily know all the things that you're wanting to be doing. We ran a training grant in 2023 where we subsidized 50% of any courses that people wanted to do, up to £500, available for anyone across the region, and supported a huge number of farmers to be able to do everything from going to conferences and those sort of things to doing basis training. There was a huge range of things that are doing, and we're looking to expand that program going forward. We did a range of work around cover crops. Our scheme was exploring what could we do, how could we add value beyond things. So we weren't looking to subsidize the straight production. What we were looking was how can we add value and discussion in terms of the ranges of mix that we're looking at. So we were funding 100 farmers to do 10 hectares of cover crops. And this was looking to do enhanced and broader mixes. And I've got a slide, if I've got time, I'll touch on a little bit later. We had a little bit of work looking at pigs using grass, as well as some undersowing trials, and the big grant that we did last year, well, this year, has been our farm innovation grant. A key thing here is flagging this instead of working out a list of solutions, what we've done is said, this is the problem we have. At this particular abstraction in this river, these are the challenges that we have. Every farmer knows their land way better than we can. So what are the things that you can do on your farm to help us address the challenges that we have? The key thing here is how can we put agriculture, land managers as part of that solution, where often other parts of the industry are very much saying, well, farmers are part of the problem. It's not as though we've got all the answers, and certainly it's interesting to see the projects that we're doing. What's been really interesting is the amount of, with freedom to plan what we're doing, how much extra money and additional investment farmers have been able to leverage from other sources. Our hope is that we will have a significantly larger budget available going forward, but that's a key thing. And we are kind of working out what we're doing. I would say broadly, Anglian Water is probably 5 years behind, 3 to 5 years behind where Severn Trent is on those sort of things in terms of the resources and the priorities. I would say a lower hanging fruit going forward is also things like phosphate. We're also looking to support cluster groups and also partner with as many people in the supply chain if they are a useful and relevant partner in that area. So a lot of them are interested in regen farming. If that ties into the sorts of schemes that we're looking at, then we're looking at there. But it's very much individual conversations there. Next slide. very quickly on this one here, that in our grant scheme, we find a lot more people are looking for, this is the cover crop scheme, looking for more diverse mixes. We're going to look into that a little bit more detail. Next slide. Some of the other connections that we have. So as I said, we're supporting cluster groups, we're supporting weather and weather information wherever possible. I think we've got a network of about 40 weather stations now in the network. And the last slide, please, because I'm conscious that I've overrun a lot. If you want to be added onto our mailing list to find out what we're doing, if you've got ideas of things that you think we should be doing that we've maybe missed, then scan the QR code, get hold of Chris Hewis. That should give the right details to get hold of him. So that is me, and apologies for overrunning. And I'll hand over.
Hiya, thanks, Richard. So I'm Bethany Turner from the CLA, and I lead on environmental policy, but specifically around nature and natural capital. So could we just have the next part of the slide? Thanks, Andrew. So you've obviously already heard about government schemes from Richard, and you've heard about business funding from the two water companies. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about offset markets and the opportunities that they present as a alternative sort of long-term income stream. But something else just to flag is that there is other sort of potential for income and advice funding from charities, which is the other thing on this slide, as well as one-off government schemes like the Species Survival Fund. So just to make note of those. So could we have the next slide, Andrew? Thank you. And the next part of it. Sorry, I think these slides have got transitions. So what are offset markets, or what do we mean by them? So there are two types. There are compliance markets and there are voluntary markets. So an offset market is essentially a way for a business to compensate for the environmental impact that they are having. A compliance market being one they're required to enter by law, and a voluntary one being one where they are entering it to do good, essentially. So there are two compliance markets in England. There's biodiversity net gain, which I'm going to talk about today, and there's nutrient neutrality, which is only applicable to certain parts of the country. Then there are these voluntary markets. So they're basically two broad categories. There's carbon markets, which are to do with reaching net zero, and nature markets, which are to do with restoring biodiversity. So as these markets grow and develop, there'll be more opportunities to make money from them. And the background, they're all underpinned by the government targets for nature restoration. So those are in the Environment Improvement Plan and in other places. And because the government has these ambitions, these markets will keep growing. So biodiversity net gain, like I said, is the one I'm going to talk about today. But it is worth thinking about whether the other types of offset market might be better for you. So it's a really good idea to get a natural capital baseline assessment for your holding if you're interested in entering these markets. And that will allow you to decide what opportunities are best for you. So whether that's BNG, whether it's other nature markets or something else entirely like ecotourism, having that assessment will give you a bit of an idea of what's going on. So biodiversity net gain, or BNG, is basically about creating and supplying off-site biodiversity units for developers. So it's an opportunity to use your land to create and sell these units, which developers will buy from you because they are required to offset the biodiversity they harm, but also deliver a 10% uplift. So from the 12th of February, so next week, all developments that are in scope will be required to do this 10% uplift in biodiversity, which means the market will start to grow quite rapidly as more and more demand for credits comes through. So developers can do the biodiversity offsetting themselves on site, which basically means within the planning boundary, or they can do it off site. So that's the opportunity for land managers, is to make these profits through getting into the offsite market. So as it says on the slide, the credits are measured by the biodiversity metric, which is a really robust tool which has been developed over about a decade by Natural England to essentially assess biodiversity value. And because it's such a robust tool, that's why this market has sort of more credibility possibly than other markets. So if we have the next slide, please. Thank you, Andrew. So there are basically three ways of accessing the market, depending on your business and your strategy. So the most sort of high risk, high reward option is to develop your own project. So you could do that as a sole landowner. You could do it as a joint venture with other people in a similar position. And by doing it this way, creating and selling your own units, you've got the most opportunity to profit. Equally, you've got the most sort of logistics, the most upfront costs, that kind of thing. So if you are developing your own project, there are two ways you can do it. One is by creating a habitat bank. So essentially you create the biodiversity improvement and then sell it to developers. The other way is developing on demand. So you're more or less selling a promise to deliver the unit to a developer. So if you do the habitat banking route, there is obviously more upfront investment, but for some specialist units like woodland, that's probably the way you would need to go. Whereas delivery on demand means that because you've got the agreement in place to deliver a set number of units, you've got the price upfront, so you have that certainty. So that's developing your own project. You can also work with a project developer. Obviously that reduces the risk for you, but it also means that they take a cut of the profit. Or the third option is to lease land to a company who will create the units and sell them, and you will get a rental payment. So you'll get much more certain income, but equally you won't get those potential profits. So next slide, please. So these are what we've called the steps to access BNG, but it's worth noting that the first three are kind of interchangeable. You wouldn't have to work through them in that order. But as I've already mentioned, getting a kind of baseline assessment is a good first step so that you know what you've got, what opportunities you've got, and whether BNG is right for you. If it is, then the next stage is to get a BNG assessment. So this would need to be done by a qualified ecologist using the biodiversity metric, which means it's quite expensive. So you would only want to do it on the land you are definitely planning to take into BNG rather than across your whole holding. And it's something important to note at this point is that BNG unit prices can vary quite drastically for different habitats. And the biodiversity metric essentially calculates the unit based on habitat size, condition, ecological importance, and location. So that's kind of assessing what biodiversity opportunities you've got. The next stage is about the local market opportunities. So because, as we've said, this is an emerging market, it will vary quite a lot from place to place, depending on what development's going on, how much of it's been doing on site, and how the local authority are sort of handling it. So you would need to look into what opportunities there are. So the CLA have been working on this with the Future Homes Hub to produce a biodiversity unit finder, which is basically a listing of biodiversity units. Again, this will grow as more and more units are offered. And also at this stage, again, you want to consider what route to the market's best for you. So whether you want to work with a developer, do it yourself, that kind of thing. Then the next part is obviously about training, knowledge, advice. So like I've said, you'll need to work with an ecologist, but you will also need to seek specialist tax and legal advice to make sure that everything's in place. So could I have the next slide, please? So market reality. So like I said, the income that you can get from this is very variable, and it depends which route you take, what kind of habitats you've got, and what the demand is. But as a very rough sort of rule of thumb, we would say that the typical income per hectare you might expect would be £40,000 or more. So that's based on 2 units per hectare. But again, that is hugely variable. And you've also got to consider the upfront costs. So while the number sounds quite attractive at first glance, you need to think about the costs and the uncertainty, and also how payments will be made. So typically, the payment would be made at the start of the 30-year agreement, but there are different ways of doing it depending on which sort of model you go down. Something else to think about is that some land will be much better suited than others. So obviously you're almost certainly going to have land that's best suited to food production. And actually the best type of land for BNG is land that's in quite poor environmental conditions so that you can deliver that uplift and show the improvement. So you would need, again, that assessment to see what your options are. Something else to consider is about BNG in protected sites, so SSSIs and those kinds of things. So strictly speaking, you can do BNG in those sites. The problem is that BNG can't be used to deliver what Natural England have kind of agreed to deliver. So you would have to demonstrate that you were doing something completely separate or above, which is quite tricky to demonstrate in practice. And again, that can all feed into the pricing. So there is statutory unit pricing, but these are made deliberately expensive because they're essentially a last resort for developers. So while it is definitely an interesting opportunity, you just need to make sure you're very aware of all the different kind of considerations and the realities of the market. The next slide, please. So as I mentioned, legal and tax considerations are going to be important, and the the key message here is you need to seek specialist advice. So on the legal contract side, there are two ways that these agreements can be put in place. And for a BNG unit, the agreement must be at least 30 years. So this is a long-term change. So the agreements can be done through conservation covenants or Section 106 agreements. So a Section 106 agreement you might be familiar with. It's basically a way of putting planning conditions in place, and it's enforced by the local authority. So currently all BNG is being done through that route, but these conservation covenants, which were introduced a couple of years ago by the Environment Act, are kind of in the development stage. So while they won't just be used for BNG, we expect to see them used over the next few years, and they're enforced by a responsible body, but again, seek specialist legal advice. On the tax side of things, there are implications for inheritance tax and capital gains tax, so you would want specialist advice here too. And all of that adds into your kind of cost you need to consider when you're thinking about whether to go into this. Next slide, please. So Richard's obviously talked to you already about government funding and the ELM schemes, but this is just to quickly talk about how they interact with BNG. So these are BNG and the other nature markets are private markets, but it's something that the government is keen to support. So there are various schemes in place to help you get into them. The main one of interest is landscape recovery. So one of the 3 ELM schemes, which has had 2 rounds and will have a 3rd round this year, although we don't have a date for that yet. So projects which are successful in this scheme can be single landowners, they're generally collaborative, and the scheme is basically 2 years of funding to develop a blended finance plan for large-scale nature restoration. So for projects in the first round, a lot of them are looking into BNG as a way of blending that finance, but the scheme's a good catalyst for kind of working those details out. And there are also similar schemes like the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, not the catchiest name, sometimes called NERF, which again does a similar thing. Something else to be aware of is the interaction. So if you're already in a scheme, whether it's countryside stewardship, SFI or HLS, you can withdraw from that scheme in order to enter a nature market, but you would need to demonstrate that you are going well above what you would have delivered in that scheme. So you would need to have a conversation with the RPA about withdrawing your land and how that works. In some circumstances, you can have BNG and an agri-environment scheme on the same land, but because you can't be paid for the same thing twice, you would need to ensure that you're doing something completely different. So whatever you're delivering through BNG would need to be a completely separate activity to your scheme options. Next slide, Andrew. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour because you've obviously already had quite a lot of information. But if you're interested in BNG, these are kind of the key things to consider. So if it fits with your business plans, and as part of that, your long-term business plan. So at the end of the 30-year agreement, technically the land is yours to do with as you wish. But in practical terms, there are going to be some restrictions. So if you've made your land grassland or woodland, it would be subject to the relevant impact assessments or felling licenses. And there is a risk that your land might be designated because it is now in very good ecological condition. So you need to think about whether the payment is enough to justify the 30-year agreement and the potential longer term implications. The other thing is it might impact on land value. At this stage, it's an emerging market and there are lots of unknowns. So it's hard to say exactly how it will impact your land value, but that's something you'd want to maybe get advice on or consider as part of it. And again, all the different costs that are involved are part of the considerations. So while the payments can sound attractive, there is a lot to think about, but it is definitely a massive market, which is growing very rapidly as of Monday. So if you just have the last slide. So a little bit of a CLA resources. So we've got lots of guidance notes. We've got a new one being published this week on biodiversity net gain. So for CLA members, if you get in touch with us, we can give you some advice, point you in the right direction. We also have our natural capital directory, which is basically a directory of businesses that might be able to help you in this field. So you can find the specialists that you need. And there's also the Green Finance Institute Hive and the Nature-Based Finance Learning Hub, which are also useful resources. So there are lots of things to think about, but the advice and the expertise is there and it shouldn't put you off. So that's all from me. So I'll hand back to Andrew now.
Thanks very much for that, Bethany, and thank you all of our speakers for excellent presentations there. We've got a few minutes to get through some questions, so I will just pick those up. So the first question actually came in quite early on. I think it's directed to Richard Wordsworth. I'd like to know, when will HLS be retired, and what is the process of moving from HLS to the SFI countryside stewardship schemes, if that's something that Richard, you're happy to pick up?
Yeah, sure, Andrew. Thank you. Yes, so yes, the narrative that DEFRA are currently using and RPA using is they're going to retire HLS. That might come as rather a startling sort of use of words, but essentially HLSs will continue. They are being rolled over each year. They're being rolled over, but they're being rolled over for a shorter period of time. So I believe this year they're being rolled over for 4 years. Next year it'll be 3 years. The year after it'll be 2 years. With, I think, an intention that they will all effectively cease operating in 2028. Obviously, that's a little way away, but that's the current vision. Obviously, when an existing 10-year HLS agreement comes to an end, there's obviously assessment done by Natural England RPA to see whether it's suitable to roll over into an extended agreement, and obviously some of those then drop out at that point in time. So obviously agreement holders do have the option as they get to the end of the agreement whether to take up the rollover or indeed take a different route, whether that's countryside stewardship, sustainable farming incentive, countryside stewardship, higher tier on that side. So yeah, that's the general aim, and I think DEFRA's general thinking here is that they will make the alternative as at least attractive as the current HLS to allow people to transfer across from one to the other. But the answer to the question ultimately is where you are in your agreement cycle and what options may be ahead of you on that side. Hopefully that helps.
Great, thanks very much for that, Richard. Just looking through a few more of the Q&A entries that we've had. So there's a question here: can the Farm Resilience Fund be used to have a BNG assessment rather than just what SFI, etc., we can apply for? Can you pick that one up, Richard?
Yeah, so the Farming Resilience Fund initially, its original ethos was to help farming businesses, core business, financial and business structural type elements. But I believe some of the providers will provide things if you've got those elements sort of under control and in check and underway. Then potentially some of the providers could have discussions with you about BNG. Initial, there's essentially £1,000 of professional fees available to be paid for via the Farming Resilience Fund. But obviously, if discussions go beyond that, well, then that becomes a launch pad into more ongoing discussions or where things end up.
Great, thank you. And then another quick one, I think this would be for Adam. When will the STEPS 2024 handbook be available online? Are there plans for that to be published and made available quite soon, Adam?
Yes, it should be up there now, but for various reasons, it's not made its way onto the website yet. So apologies for that, but yeah, probably in the next couple of weeks, it should appear on as a downloadable PDF.
Great, thank you. And for Richard Reynolds, there's a couple of questions that have just been put forward about accessing the funding opportunities through Anglian Water. Is it going to be a case of reaching out directly to the catchment, your relevant catchment advisor for your particular patch, or where would people go to kind of get some of that information and that support?
Yeah, two ways. Get hold of the local advisor. So Chris Hewis is the kind of key for Lincolnshire for us. Link up on our that QR code that I pinged there. That should get you onto that mailing list. We are looking to evolve what we have. So equally, if there's something we're not doing at the moment, put it through as an idea. We're looking to evolve it. I don't think, the world's changing so quickly. What we need now and what's relevant now might be totally different in 2 years. So it is very much reaching out and saying, well, how can we support with the vested interest of what are the tools you need in your hand?
Great, thank you. And I guess that's where a big part of the the working with farm clusters really sort of feeds into that, so you can see the stuff that's going on the ground and how you can contribute towards that process.
Yeah, a year ago we never had that sort of stuff, so it is kind of trying to be as reactive as possible.
Perfect, thank you. And then finally, just a quick one that I have seen there to Bethany. I think you may have kind of picked it up really in your presentation, but we're just thinking about the long-term obligations and restrictions on the land beyond that the 30-year agreement term. So primarily looking at the sort of the restrictions that are placed, I guess, through environmental impact assessments and things like that. But is it going to be quite an onerous process for people to be able to take their land back in hand if, for whatever reason, the BNG site isn't really right for the business in 30 years' time?
So you can, in theory, definitely get your land back, and then it's up to you what you do. So one of those options would be you then start essentially a second BNG scheme. So create additional units and keep delivering that uplift. Obviously, that might not be right, and you might want to take it back. It would really depend what type of habitat you'd created. So if you've created woodland, you'd be subject to the felling license restrictions, whereas if you'd created wetland, it would be a completely different situation. So it's really going to depend on the specific habitats. But you would then again, you might look at different kind of income streams, so things like ecotourism. The main limitation we would sort of be worried about is this risk of designation. So because Natural England have a duty to designate sites that are of importance, if you have delivered this habitat restoration and the site becomes of importance, it could become a triple SI. So that's the main sort of limitation, but there's by no means definite, and that's when you essentially have to wait and see what happened. But in theory, the land is yours to do what you want with once that legal agreement has ended.